He was one of two major philosophers.
What was it? What was his name again?
Dantès Bellegarde.
Okay.
Born in 1877, died in 1966 at 89 years old. He was, at the end of his life, the oldest ambassador in Washington, D.C. He'd been as Haitian ambassador to the U.S. on several occasions, and at 80 years old, he was named ambassador here, and became, as a result, I think, the dean of the ambassadorial the embassies here. He was a major philosopher in Haitian history. He wrote 19 books and hundreds of articles. Received honors from all over the world. Some of the highest honors out of France, Canada, Venezuela, Cuba, that kind of thing. And was twice the ambassador in France, once to the Vatican. The League of Nations, where created the furor because he denounced the United States that had invaded Haiti and was still in Haiti at that time. But he represented Haiti at the League of Nations and later on at the United Nations, and another post as well. And the other major philosopher was his very good friend, Jean-Pierre, who is credited by everyone as the father of the Negritude movement.
Of the what?
Negritude movement. That's indigenism. That's Negritude is okay. The French countries of Africa have Negritude and the Caribbean, and the British colonies had how did they call it, the African personality, and those were the black people in the Caribbean and in Africa meeting in France as students in their 20s in Paris, who decided that they had had enough of France and being turned into little black Frenchmen. And so that was the nemesis of my grandfather. However, they had gone to school together. They were very close friends. They loved each other. And when my grandfather died in June of 1966, the first person to come to the house was Jean-Pierre, his nemesis, who was a year older, 2 years older than my grandfather. And so I've always lived under his shadow. I lived in the same property. We had this giant property in the middle of Port-au-Prince, and every time he had 7 children, and every time a daughter married, she built a house on that property. So we had 5 different houses there, all my cousins and everybody else. And my grandfather's house, which must be about 175 years old now, a wooden structure that has survived the 2010 earthquake. All the other houses have collapsed.
Wow.
They were much
on
newer.
Property, just
on that property, much newer, but there were cinder blocks and that kind of thing. Did
they collapse during the earthquake or
during the earthquake? Yeah. And so for a while there, some of my cousins were living in their cars, but that house stands still, and it was a wonderful property. Lots of beautiful plants and that kind of thing, coconut trees, orange trees, grapefruit trees. So about 10 different kinds of mangoes. And as a child, I knew this is the mango tree belonging to Aunt so-and-so, the mango tree belonging to Aunt so-and-so, that kind of thing. Much later, decades later, I found out this is where my grandfather had buried the umbilical cords of these aunts. That's a very African thing to do. That's pure Africa. And so the mango tree belonging to Tante Mayotte, that was. And I'm writing a chapter right now for a book that I'm co-editing with a very close friend of mine on women and voodoo. And for the first time in my life, I'm using the personal pronoun, the I, instead of, because we're trained as social scientists, to be objective and to, in terms of that approach, you never use the I pronoun. And I'm talking about the women in my family. And they were very powerful women. 2 of my aunts co-created the women's movement in the country back in the 1930s. But also, I had my great-grandmother, whom I knew, my grandfather's mother. She was born in 1858, died in 1952. And I was 5 years old when she died, and I remember her. In fact, I found out much later that I was her favorite great-grandchild. And I would sing her in Haitian Creole. I would comb her hair in the afternoon at 5 years old, and that kind of thing. And she was a very powerful individual. And one of my great aunts was a feminist in the 19th century in Haiti as well. And my grandfather, when he presided over the assembly that created the 1950 Constitution, had to fight, because it was an all-man assembly, to get women the right to vote, which was passed eventually in 1950 and became effective in 1956, 1957. So women were able to vote, and I remember my mom and all of her sisters going to vote. And that was partly because of her father's action, who believed in the power of women.
So